They said the Alpha King was dying. Not from poison, not from war, but from a curse that was eating his life from the inside. And on the night he accepted death, he walked into a slave market, not to buy power, not to buy loyalty, but to buy one last chance to live. Then he saw her, the only girl in chains who looked at the most feared alpha in the world, and smiled. You just bought the one thing your enemies prayed you would never find. He thought she was his cure. He had no idea she was a hidden queen, or that loving her would cost him everything. For generations, the Nightfang Pack stood as the most feared kingdom in the wolf world. Its borders stretched across mountains no rival dared to cross. Its warriors were legends. Its enemies vanished before they ever reached the gates. And at the center of that power stood one man, Kale Draven, the Alpha King, a ruler whose name was spoken with equal parts reverence and fear. He had survived wars that should have ended his bloodline. He had crushed rebellions before they could become history. And he had built a kingdom so strong that many believed nothing in this world could ever bring him to his knees. But power has never guaranteed survival. Because while Kale's enemies searched for ways to destroy him from the outside, something unseen was already destroying him from within. At first, the changes were subtle. A brief weakness during training, a sharp pain beneath his ribs, a heartbeat that occasionally faltered without warning. Kale ignored it. Kings do not have the luxury of illness. They endure. They command. They keep moving even when their bodies begin to fail. But this was not an ordinary sickness. The pain grew worse. His wolf, once overwhelming in strength, became quieter with each passing moon. His senses dulled. His healing slowed. And for the first time in his life, Kale Draven was forced to confront a possibility he had never allowed himself to consider. He was dying. The royal healers searched every ancient text in the Nightfang archives. They tested herbs, blood rituals, and forgotten magic. Nothing worked. The curse continued to spread. Dark markings crept across his chest like roots sinking deeper into his heart. Each new mark was a warning. And each warning carried the same message. Time was running out. Outside the castle walls, rumors spread quickly. Kings do not weaken in secret. The rival packs began to circle. Some prepared for war. Others waited patiently, knowing that death could accomplish what armies never could. If Kale Draven fell, Nightfang would become vulnerable. And in the wolf world, vulnerability was an invitation. The council understood this better than anyone. For weeks, they met behind closed doors. Ancient scrolls were brought from hidden chambers. Records sealed for centuries were finally opened. And buried within those forbidden texts, they found a story older than the Nightfang throne itself. It spoke of a lost royal bloodline, a lineage blessed by moon magic so powerful that its blood could break curses no healer could touch. The bloodline had supposedly vanished generations ago. Most believed it was nothing more than legend, a story told to desperate rulers who had run out of options. Kale treated it the same way, a myth. And Kale Draven had never trusted myths. But desperation changes the way even the strongest kings think. Because when death is no longer a distant possibility, legends begin to feel less like stories and more like chances. Then the council brought him information they claimed could not be ignored. Beyond the cursed border, in a lawless territory where names were stripped away and people were sold like livestock, a slave auction was preparing to offer a girl unlike any they had ever seen. No pack claimed her. No scent identified her bloodline. No records explained where she came from. And every attempt to uncover her past had failed. To most buyers, she was merely another captive. To the council, she might be the final answer to a dying king's prayer. Kale had every reason to dismiss the report. He was an alpha king. Not a man who chased rumors through black markets and forgotten territories. But the curse on his chest had reached his heart. The healers could no longer promise him another season. And so, for the first time in his reign, Kale Draven crossed the cursed border in search of a stranger he had never met. The journey took him to a city that did not appear on official maps. A place where power was measured in gold and mercy had long since been forgotten. The auction house stood at the center of it all. A fortress of stone and iron where the desperate were bought and sold under the cover of privilege. Inside, nobles, mercenaries, and warlords gathered to bid on human lives as though they were commodities. Cale entered without ceremony. The room changed the moment he arrived. Conversations lowered. Eyes followed him. Even among criminals, the presence of the Alpha King demanded caution. But Cale was not there to intimidate anyone. He was there because his life depended on what happened next. One by one, the captives were brought onto the platform. Warriors, servants, healers. Each was examined, evaluated, and sold. Cale remained unmoved. Then the auctioneer announced the final lot of the night. Property 47. She was led onto the stage in chains. And for the first time that evening, the room fell completely silent. There was nothing outwardly extraordinary about her appearance. No crown, no title, no visible mark of status. But there was something in the way she stood. She did not lower her eyes. She did not tremble. She did not plead. Surrounded by men who viewed her as an object, she carried herself with the composure of someone who had lost everything and feared nothing. The auctioneer listed her details. No known family. No confirmed origin. No identifiable scent. No rank. No history. No explanation. A mystery reduced to a number. Property 47. Cale studied her from across the room. And in that instant, something impossible happened. The pain in his chest eased. The constant pressure that had haunted him for years suddenly weakened. His breathing steadied. His wolf, which had grown quieter with every passing day, stirred with a force he had not felt in months. Cale said nothing, but he understood what that moment meant. Either fate had brought him to the one person who could save his life, or he was placing his trust in the most dangerous mistake he had ever made. The bidding began. Several wealthy buyers raised their offers. Cale ended the contest with a single number so high that no one dared challenge it. The hammer struck. Property 47 was sold to the Alpha King. As the chains were transferred into Cale's custody, many in the room assumed they were witnessing a transaction. A desperate king purchasing a possible cure. A powerful ruler buying one final chance at survival. But none of them knew what was truly being set into motion. Because the girl Cale had just purchased was not who she appeared to be. And the decision he believed would save his life would soon expose secrets buried long before he was born. As they left the auction house, Lyra walked beside him in silence. She did not thank him. She did not ask where he was taking her. She simply observed him with an unsettling calm, as though she understood something he did not. Then, without warning, she spoke. She said that he was more desperate than she had expected. Cale turned toward her. For the first time that night, he saw the faintest hint of a knowing smile. It was not the expression of a frightened captive. It was the expression of someone who had just watched fate unfold exactly as she knew it would. And in that moment, one question began to take shape in Cale Draven's mind. Who had he really brought home? The journey back to Nightfall Castle should have been uneventful. The Alpha King had what he came for. The mysterious girl from the slave market was in his custody. And for the first time in years, the curse that had been tightening around his heart had grown quiet. By all appearances, Cale Draven should have felt victorious. Instead, he spent the entire ride studying the woman seated across from him. Lyra sat with her hands loosely bound, though the restraints seemed almost symbolic. She did not test them. She did not ask questions. She did not demand freedom. She simply stared out through the carriage window at the dark forest slipping past, as calm as if she were returning to a place she had known all her life. That calm unsettled Cale more than open defiance ever could. Most captives begged. Others threatened. Some broke down in tears. Lyra did none of those things. She behaved as though the outcome of this journey did not concern her. As though she already knew how it would end. Several times, Cale caught himself waiting for her to reveal fear. Each time, she offered only silence. And with every mile, one thought returned to him. No one should be this composed after being sold. When the black towers of Nightfall Castle finally rose against the moonlit sky, Cale felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not from the curse. From anticipation. Because he knew exactly how his people would react. Nightfall was not merely a castle. It was the heart of an empire. A fortress built by generations of warriors who valued strength, loyalty, and bloodline above all else. Every stone carried the memory of battles fought to preserve their rule. Every banner represented victories paid for with sacrifice. And into this world, Kale was bringing a nameless slave. A stranger with no scent, no rank, and no explanation. The gates opened. The carriage rolled into the central courtyard. Within moments, word spread. Torches flared to life along the walls. Warriors gathered in disciplined rows. Servants whispered behind lowered heads.
The air changed.
Curiosity gave way to unease. Then Kale stepped down from a carriage. A moment later, Lyra followed. The courtyard fell silent. Dozens of eyes fixed on her. She stood in simple clothes, her wrists marked by chains, yet there was nothing submissive in the way she carried herself. She did not hunch her shoulders. She did not avert her gaze. She surveyed the ancient fortress with the measured composure of someone assessing a place rather than fearing it. The reaction was immediate. Whispers moved through the crowd.
Who is she?
Why did he bring her here? What is she? Then the crowd parted. A tall warrior stepped forward, broad-shouldered and battle-scarred, with eyes sharpened by years of war. Darius Bex, Kale's beta commander, his closest advisor, the man who had stood beside him longer than anyone still living. They had trained together as boys, fought their first battles side by side, buried friends together. And when Kale ascended to the throne, Darius swore an oath that went beyond duty. He vowed to protect his king with his life. For years, he had kept that promise without hesitation. But the moment Darius looked at Lyra, something hardened in his expression. He stepped toward Kale, lowering his voice, though not enough to hide the force behind his words. If Kale wished to bring danger into the heart of Nightfall, Darius would not remain silent. The message was unmistakable. This was not concern. It was opposition. Kale held his friend's gaze. The tension between them was immediate and unmistakable. Two men who trusted each other completely, now divided by a woman neither truly understood. Around them, the courtyard waited. Darius spoke with the conviction of someone prepared to be hated if it meant saving the person he loved like a brother. He would rather lose his king than watch him be destroyed by a stranger. The words landed with the weight of prophecy. Kale said nothing, because part of him understood exactly why Darius was afraid. Yet even as his beta challenged him, Kale felt something he had not felt in years.
Strength.
The curse remained quiet. His heartbeat was steady. For the first time in a long time, death did not feel close enough to touch. And the only difference was Lyra. Kale ordered that she be given chambers in the royal wing. The courtyard erupted into murmurs. A slave had never been housed there. But Kale did not explain himself. He simply turned and walked into the castle, trusting Lyra to follow.
She did.
Without hesitation, without gratitude, without fear. That night, Nightfall Castle did not sleep. Rumors traveled through every corridor. Some claimed the girl was a witch. Others believed she had bewitched the king. A few insisted she was an assassin waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the war room, Darius began asking questions. No records, no scent, no past. Nothing about Lyra made sense. And Darius had learned long ago that what could not be explained was often the greatest threat. Meanwhile, Kale stood alone on the balcony outside his chamber. For months, even the cold night air had felt heavy in his lungs. Tonight, he breathed easily.
He pressed a hand to his chest.
The curse marks remained, but the agony was gone, not weakened.
Gone.
A soft movement behind him drew his attention. Lyra stepped onto the balcony. No guard announced her. No footsteps had warned him. One moment, he was alone. The next, she was standing beside him, her silver hair stirring in the wind. Kale studied her in silence. Again, the pain did not return. His wolf, usually restless and weakened, became unusually calm, not subdued, comforted, as if her presence soothed something ancient inside him. Lyra rested her hands on the stone railing and looked out over the kingdom. Below them stretched the lands Cale had fought his entire life to protect. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Cale noticed something strange. Moonlight was spilling across the carved symbols etched into the balcony walls. Ancient runes older than the castle itself. Runes that had remained dormant for generations. As Lyra stood near them, faint silver light began to pulse beneath the stone. Cale stared. The glow lasted only seconds. Then it vanished. Lyra did not react. Either she had not seen it, or she had expected it. Cale turned toward her, searching for any sign of surprise. There was none. Only that same unreadable calm. And in that silence, the questions surrounding her became impossible to ignore. Who was she? Why did his curse retreat in her presence? Why did ancient magic respond to her as if recognizing someone it had been waiting for? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did she seem completely unsurprised by any of it? Below them, Nightfang Castle slept uneasily. Within its walls, suspicion was growing. In the war room, Darius was beginning an investigation that would uncover secrets no one was prepared to face. And on the highest balcony of the fortress, the dying Alpha King stood beside the woman he believed might save his life. Still unaware that bringing her home had already set forces in motion that would test every loyalty he possessed. Because Lyra was not just a mystery. She was the answer to questions Cale had never thought to ask. And the closer he came to the truth, the more dangerous that truth would become. Morning came to Nightfang Castle under a sky the color of ash. From the highest towers, the fortress appeared unchanged. The banners still hung from the battlements. The guards still marched their assigned routes. The servants still moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency. To anyone looking from the outside, the kingdom remained exactly as it had been the day before. But inside those ancient walls, something had shifted. The Alpha King was no longer dying in agony. A nameless girl slept in the royal wing, and no one could explain why. The uncertainty spread quickly. Among warriors, uncertainty was more dangerous than any enemy. Because an enemy could be fought, a mystery could not. By midday, the whispers had reached every corner of the castle. Some claimed the girl was a healer. Others insisted she was cursed. A few were certain she had enchanted the king. Each version carried the same question. What exactly had Cale Draven brought into Nightfang? The answer seemed no closer when Lyra appeared in the central courtyard that afternoon. She walked alone, escorted at a distance by two guards who looked more uneasy than protective. The courtyard was alive with training. Steel clashed. Orders rang across the stone. Warriors sparred beneath the watchful eyes of their commanders. Yet as Lyra crossed the yard, the rhythm faltered. Conversations softened. Eyes followed her. The girl from the slave market moved through the center of the most powerful pack in the kingdom as if she had every right to be there. No lowered head. No hurried steps. No visible concern. That composure provoked the wrong kind of attention. One of the younger guards stepped into her path. He was broad-shouldered, arrogant, and eager to prove himself before his peers. His smile carried the confidence of someone who had never been forced to face consequences. He made a remark that drew laughter from a few nearby warriors. Then he reached for Lyra's wrist. It happened in an instant. His fingers closed around her skin. Lyra stopped. She turned her head and looked at him. There was no fear in her expression. No anger. Only a sudden stillness. The guard's smile vanished. His eyes widened. He staggered backward. For one stunned second, he seemed unable to understand what was happening. Then he collapsed. His body struck the stone with a sickening thud. The courtyard fell silent. The laughter died immediately. Warriors rushed forward. The castle healer dropped to one knee and examined the guard. No wound, no poison, no visible cause. And yet the man was dead. Completely and unmistakably dead. The silence that followed was unlike anything Nightfang had experienced in years. Even the wind seemed to stop. Every eye turned to Lyra. She stood exactly where she had been, her face unreadable. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet enough that those closest had to lean in to hear. He touched what was never his to touch. No one moved. No one answered. Because in that moment, the girl with no scent and no history seemed far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The alarm reached Cale within seconds. He arrived to find the courtyard frozen in place. Warriors stood back from Lyra as though an invisible boundary surrounded her. The dead guard remained on the stones. And at the center of it all stood the woman whose presence had been keeping him alive. Cale looked from the body to Lyra. The implication was impossible to ignore. But so was the expression in her eyes. She did not look triumphant. She did not look cruel. She looked tired. As though this was not the first time fear had followed her. Cale ordered the courtyard cleared. Within minutes, he escorted Lyra to a private chamber deep within the royal wing. The doors closed. For the first time since bringing her to Nightfang, Cale allowed his composure to crack. He demanded the truth.
Who was she?
What had happened in the courtyard? How had an unarmed girl killed a trained warrior without laying a hand on him? Lyra listened in silence. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she crossed to the window and stared out at the forest beyond the castle walls. When she finally spoke, her answer raised more questions than it resolved. Some bloodlines carried protections older than kingdoms. Protections that did not distinguish between intent and trespass. Cale pressed for details. Lyra offered none. She would not deny what had happened, but she would not explain it either. The conversation should have ended in anger. Instead, something unexpected happened. Cale noticed that her hands were trembling. Only slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to reveal what her expression concealed. Beneath the calm exterior was someone carrying burdens she had no intention of sharing. For the first time, Cale saw not a mystery, not a cure, not a possible threat. He saw a woman who had spent her life surviving alone. And for reasons he did not fully understand, that realization affected him more than any answer she could have given. Lyra seemed to sense the change. She turned toward him, clearly expecting suspicion. Perhaps accusation. Perhaps fear. What she found instead was concern. Not because of what she could do, but because of what she had endured. It was a look she did not appear accustomed to receiving. For a brief moment, the distance between them narrowed. Not through touch. Not through confession. But through recognition. Two people shaped by loneliness. Two survivors who trusted no one. And two hearts beginning to understand each other despite every reason to resist. Elsewhere in the castle, Darius Vex was reaching conclusions of his own. The death in the courtyard confirmed what he had feared from the beginning. Lyra was not harmless. And if Cale refused to see the danger, Darius would uncover it himself. That night, he descended into the oldest section of the Nightfang archives. A labyrinth of stone chambers hidden beneath the castle. Dust-covered shelves untouched for generations. Ancient scrolls rested in locked cabinets sealed by forgotten kings. Darius searched by torchlight, following a suspicion he could not shake. A woman with no scent. Protective magic strong enough to kill instantly. Ancient runes reacting to her presence. The pieces pointed toward legends he had dismissed as children's stories. Hours passed. Then Darius found a sealed chronicle detailing the Moon Crown dynasty, the royal bloodline that had once ruled the United Wolf Kingdoms. According to history, the dynasty was annihilated centuries earlier. Its heirs slaughtered. Its name erased. But the final pages told a different story. One child had escaped. A daughter hidden before the massacre. Protected by magic that concealed her scent and guarded her from those who sought to claim her. Darius's eyes moved to an illustration etched into the margin. A silver crest shaped like a crescent moon. The same symbol he had seen earlier that evening. A symbol that had appeared briefly on Lyra's wrist when the guard touched her. The blood drained from his face. If the records were true, the woman sleeping in the royal wing was no slave. She was the last surviving heir to the most powerful royal line in history. And if Cale had brought her into Nightfang believing she was merely a cure, then the Alpha King was standing at the center of a secret that could either save the kingdom or destroy it. The discovery in the archives changed everything. Darius Vex remained motionless beneath the flickering torchlight, the ancient chronicles still open in his hands. Dust drifted through the underground chamber. The pages before him trembled slightly, not because of the cold, but because of what they revealed. The woman sleeping in the royal wing was not an ordinary captive. She was not a wandering healer. She was not a fortunate coincidence. If the records were true, Lyra was the last surviving heir to the Moon Crown dynasty. A bloodline so powerful that entire kingdoms had once gone to war to control it. Darius read the final passage again, hoping he had misunderstood. The scent concealed, the blood protected, the heir hidden until the hour of return. Every line matched what he had witnessed since Lyra arrived. The missing scent, the deadly magic, the ancient symbols responding to her presence. For a long moment, Darius said nothing. Then he closed the book, and in the silence of the archives, another memory surfaced. Not of Lyra, of Cale's father. Years earlier, Darius had stood in this same castle and watched a king place his trust in the wrong person. An advisor had promised loyalty. A friend had offered reassurance. And by the time the betrayal was uncovered, it was too late. Cale's father died with a blade in his chest. Darius still remembered the look on young Cale's face as he knelt beside his father's body.
Shock, grief,
And the realization that even kings could be destroyed by the people they believed they understood. That night, Darius made a promise. As long as he lived, Cale would never suffer that fate. For years, Darius had honored that vow. He fought beside Cale in every major battle. He defended him against enemies seen and unseen. He questioned decisions others were too afraid to challenge. Not because he doubted his king, but because he loved him like a brother. And now, for the first time in years, Darius felt that promise slipping through his fingers. Because the greatest threat to Cale might not be an invading army. It might be the woman sleeping just a few doors from his chamber. The following evening, Darius requested a private audience. Cale was standing in the war room when he arrived. Maps covered the central table. Torches cast long shadows across the stone walls. The atmosphere should have felt familiar. Two warriors discussing the security of their kingdom. But the tension between them was unmistakable. Darius placed the ancient chronicle on the table. Cale looked down at the worn pages, then back at his friend. Darius did not begin with history. He began with the truth he had been avoiding. Cale was falling for her. The words settled heavily in the room. Cale's expression hardened. He dismissed the accusation immediately. Lyra was a mystery, a possible cure. Nothing more. Darius held his gaze. He had known Cale too long to be deceived by denial. He had seen the way Cale looked at her, the way his anger softened in her presence, the way he defended her even when he lacked answers. Darius spoke with the calm certainty of someone who wished he were wrong. Kings did not survive by giving their hearts to what they could not understand. For a moment, Cale said nothing. Then he turned away. The silence that followed said more than any confession. Darius realized what frightened him most. Cale was no longer thinking only as a king. He was beginning to think as a man with something to lose. And men with something to lose made dangerous decisions. Cale insisted that Lyra had saved his life, that the curse retreated whenever she was near, that whatever secrets she carried, they did not change what he had experienced. Darius listened, and beneath his loyalty, fear tightened. Because he had heard words like these before. Words spoken by Cale's father shortly before his death. Trust him. He is not what he seems. I know what I am doing. History had a way of returning when no one wanted to recognize it. Darius left the war room with a growing certainty. If Cale refused to act, he would have to act for him. That night, while the castle slept, Darius stood alone on the eastern battlements. The wind cut across the stone. Far below, the forest stretched into darkness. In his hand was a small iron token engraved with the symbol of the Crimson Claw Alliance. An enemy faction Cale had spent years keeping at bay. Darius stared at the token for a long time. To use it meant crossing a line from which there would be no easy return. But in his mind, this was not treason. It was intervention. The Crimson Claw possessed intelligence networks that reached into places Nightfang could not. If Lyra truly was the lost heir, they would know. If she was manipulating Kale, they could expose her. And once the truth was undeniable, Kale would be forced to choose his kingdom or the woman he was beginning to love. Darius tightened his grip on the token. He told himself he was protecting his king, protecting the pack, protecting the brother he had sworn to defend. Then he sent the signal. A single flare rose into the night sky beyond the castle walls. Crimson, bright enough to be seen for miles. Gone within seconds. But irreversible. Darius watched the darkness swallow the final spark. He expected relief. What he felt instead was dread. Because even he could not predict what would happen once the Crimson Claw responded. Inside the castle, Kale stood outside Lyra's chamber. He had come with questions. But for several moments, he did nothing. He simply rested his hand against the closed door, listening to the quiet on the other side. The woman beyond that door had become more than a solution to his curse. She had become the one presence that made him feel whole. And that realization was as unsettling as it was undeniable. At that same moment, in another part of the castle, Darius had set in motion events that would soon test every bond within Nightfang. The king was beginning to trust. The beta was beginning to betray. And the woman at the center of it all remained the keeper of secrets powerful enough to reshape the kingdom. By dawn, the first consequences of Darius's decision would already be moving toward Nightfang. And when they arrived, no one inside those walls would leave unchanged. The attack began just before dawn. At first, it was only a distant horn. One long, mournful blast carried across the sleeping valley. Then came another, and another. Within seconds, the stillness surrounding Nightfang Castle shattered. Alarm bells thundered from the watchtowers. Torches ignited along the battlements. Warriors poured into the corridors, fastening armor as they ran. From his chamber, Kale Draven was already moving before the first guard reached his door. Years of war had trained him to recognize the sound of imminent bloodshed. But as he stepped into the corridor, one thought struck him harder than the alarm itself. Lyra. He turned toward the royal wing. At that exact moment, the first explosion rocked the castle. The eastern wall erupted in a shower of stone and fire. The force knocked warriors off their feet. Smoke flooded the corridor. The attack had reached the heart of Nightfang faster than anyone thought possible. Outside, the Crimson Claw Alliance surged through the breach. Their banners snapped in the wind. Their war cries echoed through the valley. This was no scouting raid.
It was a full-scale assault.
And someone had given them the perfect moment to strike. Kale reached Lyra's chamber and threw open the doors. The room was empty. For one terrifying second, the world seemed to stop. Then he saw the balcony doors standing open. Moonlight poured into the chamber. And beyond the curtains, Lyra stood on the stone terrace, staring toward the burning eastern wall. She looked neither surprised nor afraid, only solemn, as if she had always known this moment would come. Kale crossed to her side. The fire below painted the sky red. Warriors were already dying in the courtyard. The enemy was advancing. Yet Lyra's attention remained fixed on the battlefield, her expression heavy with something deeper than fear. Recognition. Kale demanded to know what was happening. Before she could answer, a second explosion shook the tower. The balcony cracked beneath their feet. There was no more time for questions. Kale took her hand and led her through the smoke-filled corridors toward the central courtyard. By the time they emerged, Nightfang Castle was in chaos. Flames consumed the outer barracks. Archers loosed volleys from the walls. Wounded soldiers staggered across blood-soaked stone. The air carried the metallic scent of war. And at the center of the courtyard, Crimson Claw warriors were pushing relentlessly toward the throne hall. Kale shifted into battle with the speed and fury that had made him legendary. He tore through the first wave of attackers. Steel met claw. Blood darkened the stones. For a time, his warriors rallied around him. But the enemy kept coming. And then the battle changed. A Crimson Claw commander stepped forward. Scarred, silver-eyed, and old enough to remember the ancient dynasties. The moment he saw Lyra standing near the shattered staircase, he froze. His weapon lowered. The confidence drained from his face. He stared at her as if he were looking at a ghost. Then, in a voice barely audible above the battle, he spoke words that silenced everyone close enough to hear. "The lost princess has returned." The sentence rippled through the courtyard. Crimson Claw warriors hesitated. Nightfang soldiers exchanged stunned glances. Even Kale turned toward Lyra, searching her face for denial. There was none. For several heartbeats, she stood motionless. Then she stepped forward. The wind shifted. The air itself seemed to change. A scent spread through the courtyard. Ancient, powerful, impossible to mistake. Not the scent of a slave. Not the scent of a captive. The scent of royal blood. The effect was immediate. Every wolf in the courtyard went still. Some lowered their heads instinctively. Others dropped to one knee without understanding why. It was not fear alone. It was recognition buried deep within instinct older than memory. Silver light began to radiate from Lyra's skin. The same symbols that had flickered briefly in Nightfang Castle now burned openly around her like living moonfire. The chains of her past seemed to vanish in the brilliance. For the first time, the woman Kale had brought home stood revealed exactly as she was. Lyra Valencrest, last surviving heir to the Moon Crown dynasty. The bloodline once destined to unite the Wolf Kingdoms. The child believed murdered centuries ago. The rightful queen history had failed to erase. When she spoke, her voice carried across the battlefield with quiet authority. She had been taken as a child, hidden from those who sought to extinguish her family forever, passed from one captor to another, raised in secrecy, sold under false names, kept alive, but never allowed to reclaim the identity that was stolen from her. Every chain she wore, every humiliation she endured, every year she spent in hiding, all of it had served one purpose: to prevent this moment, to prevent her return. Kale listened in stunned silence. The truth rearranged everything he thought he knew. He had not rescued a powerless girl from a slave market. He had unknowingly brought one of the most important women in history back into the center of power. The realization was overwhelming. But Lyra was not finished. She turned to him. The light around her softened, and for a brief moment, the queen disappeared. What remained was the woman he had come to care for. There was sorrow in her eyes. Not anger, not triumph.
Sorrow.
Then she revealed the truth that struck deeper than any blade. The Nightfang Council had known who she was from the beginning. They had identified her before the auction. They had concealed that knowledge. And they had sent Kale to retrieve her, knowing his desperation would make him do what they needed. Kale's breathing slowed. The battle around him faded into distant noise. He replayed every conversation, every carefully timed suggestion, every half-truth presented as guidance. The council had not offered him hope. They had used his fear of death to place the Moon Crown heir under Nightfang control. He had believed he was making a choice. In reality, he had been maneuvered from the very beginning. The betrayal landed with crushing force. Not because he had been deceived, but because the one thing he thought was his own decision, bringing Lyra into his life, had been orchestrated by others. And yet, as Kale looked at her, one truth remained untouched. Whatever scheme had brought them together, his feelings for her were real. Around them, the battle hung in a fragile pause. The Crimson Claw warriors waited. The Nightfang soldiers stood in stunned silence. A hidden queen had returned. A king had learned he was a pawn. And the foundations of two kingdoms were shifting in real time. But the most devastating revelation had yet to come. Because somewhere within the burning castle, the man Kale trusted more than anyone else was about to face the consequences of the signal he sent into the night. The throne room of Nightfang Castle was no longer a throne room. It was a ruin wrapped in firelight. Massive stone pillars, once carved with the history of kings, now cracked under the pressure of collapsing walls. The ceiling burned in places where arrows had ignited ancient tapestries. Ash drifted down like black snow. And in the center of it all, where generations of Alpha Kings had once been crowned, stood Kale Draven. Not on a throne, not on a pedestal of power, but on broken stone, surrounded by the aftermath of betrayal and war. He could still hear Lyra's words in his mind. The council knew. They used you. Every truth felt like another fracture forming beneath his ribs. But there was no time to collapse into it, because footsteps were approaching through the fire. Measured, heavy, familiar. Cale turned slowly. Darius Vex stepped through the smoke. His armor was scorched at the edges. His face was smeared with ash. But his eyes carried something heavier than the battle outside. Not hatred, not triumph, resolve. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The flames between them crackled loudly enough to fill the silence. These were not strangers standing across a battlefield. These were two men who had shared training grounds as boys, who had survived their first war side by side, who had buried their dead together, without words. And now, standing in the ruins of their kingdom, they looked at each other like strangers forced into an impossible truth. Darius broke the silence first. His voice was steady, too steady, as if he had rehearsed this moment 100 times and still hated every version of it. He said Cale was falling, not physically, not politically, but emotionally, falling for her. The words landed like a strike that didn't need a weapon. Cale's expression tightened. For a moment, the firelight reflected something almost human in his face.
Pain.
Not anger.
Pain.
He denied it immediately. Too quickly.
Too firmly.
But even the denial sounded strained against the weight of everything that had already happened. Darius stepped closer. The distance between them shrank. And with it, the history between them became harder to ignore. Darius told him kings did not survive by trusting mysteries, by loving what could not be controlled, by placing the stability of a kingdom into the hands of something they did not understand. Cale's jaw tightened, because for the first time, he could not separate the truth from the accusation. Not fully, not cleanly. But what Darius said next shifted everything. His voice lowered. Not cruel, not mocking, but final. He said he would rather lose his king than watch him be destroyed by a stranger. A silence followed, thick enough that even the fire seemed to hesitate. Cale stared at him, and something inside him broke in a way no battlefield had ever managed to achieve. His voice, when it came, was quieter. He said, "You were my brother." For the first time, Darius hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. A crack in the armor, a memory trying to surface. But it vanished quickly, replaced by something harder. He responded that brothers do what kings are too weak to do. And then the moment shattered. Steel left its sheath, not as an act of hatred, but as the final collapse of trust. The throne room erupted into movement. Firelight flashed across blades. Stone echoed with the sound of impact. Two warriors who had once trained side by side now moved with perfect understanding of each other's rhythm. Every strike was anticipated. Every defense remembered. This was not chaos. This was history turning against itself. The fight felt personal in a way no army could ever replicate. Because every blow carried memory. Every block carried regret. Cale forced Darius backward through the ruined hall. Darius fought with discipline shaped by years of loyalty. But Cale fought with something else. Something heavier. Something that had just learned what betrayal felt like. A final strike landed. Darius stumbled, kneeling among broken stone and burning ash. His weapon slipped from his grip. The throne room fell silent except for the distant collapse of burning beams. Cale stood over him, blade raised. For a moment, everything stopped. The war outside, the kingdom burning, Lyra's revelation, the council's manipulation. It all condensed into a single choice. End him, or not. Darius looked up, waiting, not for mercy, but for judgment. Cale's hand trembled slightly, just enough to betray what he would never admit aloud. This was the man who had stood beside him longer than anyone else alive. The man who had saved his life more times than Cale could count. The man who had just torn the kingdom apart in the name of protection. And yet, Cale lowered his blade. Slowly. Not in defeat. Not in forgiveness. But in exhaustion deeper than anger. He said he had already lost enough. The words were not loud, but they carried across the ruined throne room like the final decree of something ending. Darius's expression changed. For the first time, the certainty in his eyes cracked completely. Because he understood what Cale had chosen. Not victory, not vengeance, but restraint. And in that choice, Darius saw something worse than punishment. He saw consequence. He dropped fully to his knees, the weight of everything he had done settling into him all at once. The signal, the alliance, the belief that he was preventing history from repeating itself. It all collapsed into a single realization. He had not saved Cale. He had triggered the very disaster he feared. Outside the throne room, Nightfang Castle continued to burn. Inside, two men who had once called each other brother no longer stood on the same side of anything. And somewhere beyond the flames, Lyra Valencrest's return to power was only beginning to reshape the world they thought they understood. But the most dangerous truth was still waiting to surface. Because betrayal does not end when it is revealed. It only changes who gets to decide what happens next. The throne room still burned. But the fire was no longer the most dangerous thing inside Nightfang Castle. Something deeper had awakened. Something older than the stone beneath their feet. Something that reacted to truth being spoken aloud. Lyra stood at the edge of the shattered throne platform, her gaze no longer fixed on the battlefield outside, but inward, as if listening to something only she could hear. Cale watched her from a distance. Darius remained on his knees in the ashes behind him. And for a brief moment, everything inside the castle seemed to hold its breath. Then it began. The curse inside Cale reacted. Not with pain. Not immediately. But with a pressure beneath the skin, as if something long sealed away had just noticed it was no longer alone. Cale staggered slightly. His hand went to his chest. The marks beneath his armor, silent for days, began to pulse faintly. Lyra turned toward him instantly. And in that moment, something shifted in her expression. Recognition. Not of Cale, but of what was happening to him. The air in the throne room changed. The firelight flickered unnaturally. And beneath the chaos of war outside, something far more precise began to unfold. Lyra spoke without raising her voice. As if confirming a truth she had only recently understood herself. The curse was not random. It had never been random. It was a seal. A carefully constructed binding woven into Cale's blood long before he ever became king. A mechanism designed to remain dormant. Until someone triggered it. Cale took a slow step forward. He asked what she meant. But even as he spoke, he already feared the answer. Lyra's eyes lifted slightly. And for the first time since she arrived at Nightfang Castle, there was something unmistakable in her expression. Responsibility. She explained it in fragments. Not as a confession, but as realization being forced into words. The curse was designed to respond only in the presence of moon crown blood. Not to destroy Cale. Not originally. But to awaken a balance that had been buried for generations. And now that she stood within its reach, fully awakened, fully revealed, the seal was destabilizing. The throne room trembled faintly. Stone cracked along invisible lines. The magic beneath Nightfang Castle was no longer dormant. It was waking, and it was reacting to her. Cale understood the implication before she finished speaking. If this continued unchecked, he would not survive it. The castle would not survive it. And neither would anyone still inside its walls. A distant explosion outside punctuated the silence. The Crimson Claw assault continued. But it felt far away now, as if the real battle had moved somewhere deeper than war. Lyra stepped closer to Cale. The glow beneath her skin intensified slightly. Not violent. Controlled. Barely contained. She explained the only solution. It was not a battle. It was not a spell to be broken. It was a merge. A binding of life force. Not ownership. Not domination. But exchange. A part of her essence would have to stabilize the seal inside him. In return, she would lose something she could never fully regain. Her royal strength. Her full inheritance of the Moon Crown lineage. Not destroyed, but diminished. Forever altered. Cale stared at her. And for a moment, the Alpha King who had faced armies without hesitation looked unable to move. Because he understood what she was offering. It was not just power.
It was identity.
And it was being given willingly. He refused immediately. The words came out sharp. Final. He said he would rather die than take anything else from her. The room seemed to tighten around those words. Even the fire outside the throne room flickered lower for a moment, as if listening. Lyra did not react at first. She simply stood there, quiet,
Still.
and then something in her expression softened. Not weakness, but release. As if she had been holding something inside herself for far too long. She stepped forward again, slowly, deliberately. And when she spoke, her voice was no longer uncertain. She said that for the first time in her life, this choice belonged to her. Not the council, not fate, not history, her. The words landed with quiet force.
Cale shook his head.
But he did not step back. He could not. Because something in her presence had already decided what he could not. Lyra raised her hand. Light gathered around her fingers. Not bright like fire. Not harsh like lightning. Something older. Something lunar. The symbols etched into the throne room responded instantly. Lines of ancient magic igniting beneath the stone like veins of light waking from sleep. Cale felt the curse inside him surge violently in response. For a brief second, pain returned. Not as suffering, but as alignment. As if two forces long separated had finally recognized each other. Lyra's voice dropped. Barely audible, but absolute. She began the merge. The light expanded. Not outward like an explosion, but inward. Into Cale. Into the curse. Into the sealed magic that had been waiting for this exact moment since before either of them were born. Cale reached for her instinctively, but stopped halfway, because he realized what she was doing was not being forced. It was being chosen. The throne room filled with silence, so complete it felt unreal. Even the battle outside seemed to fade. Darius lifted his head slowly from the ashes, watching with something between horror and understanding. The seal inside Cale fractured. Not violently, but precisely. Like a structure finally receiving the key it had been designed for. Lyra's knees weakened. The light around her grew unstable. Cale's curse markings flared once, and then stopped.
Completely.
Silence followed, the kind that does not feel empty, but finished. Cale stood still, breathing.
Alive.
For the first time in years without the shadow of death pressing against his chest. The curse was gone. Or no longer a curse. Lyra swayed, her strength collapsing inward as the cost of the merge took effect. Cale moved forward instantly. This time there was no hesitation. He caught her before she fell completely. Her body was lighter than he expected. Too light, as if something essential had been taken from her and distributed elsewhere. Her eyes remained open for a moment, looking at him, not as queen, not as captive, not as mystery, but as someone who had finally made a decision that belonged entirely to her. Then her strength gave out. Her head rested against his shoulder. And Lyra Valencrest, last heir of the Moon Crown dynasty, collapsed into silence in the arms of the man she had just saved. Outside the burning castle, war continued. Inside the throne room, something far more irreversible had just been completed. And Cale Draven, the Alpha King who had once bought her to save his life, now held the woman who had just rewritten it, without knowing yet what she had truly become, or what she had just cost herself to keep him alive. Dawn arrived over Nightfall Castle, like something hesitant to reveal what remained of the night. Smoke still rose from broken towers. Firefighters moved through the ruins in slow, exhausted silence. The battlefield outside had quieted, but not ended. And inside the shattered throne room, time felt suspended. Cale remained on the cold stone floor, Lyra in his arms, her body still. Too still. For several long seconds, there was no movement. No breath he could recognize. No sign that the sacrifice had succeeded in saving her at all. The Alpha King, who had survived wars without flinching, did not move. He simply held her closer, as if presence alone could undo consequence. Darius stood a few steps away, covered in ash, weapons lowered, watching without interruption, not as a commander, not as a rival, but as a man witnessing something he could no longer interfere with. Then, a shift, barely visible. Lyra's fingers moved. A small, involuntary motion against Kale's sleeve. Kale's breath caught instantly. Her eyes opened slowly.
Not sharply.
Not suddenly. Like someone returning from somewhere far away. The light around her was gone. The power that had filled the throne room moments before had faded completely. But she was alive. That was the only truth that mattered in the silence that followed. Kale tightened his grip slightly, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Lyra blinked once. Then again. Recognition returning gradually. The throne room felt different now. Quieter.
Heavier.
Not because of destruction, but because something irreversible had already settled into place. Kale looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the authority of a king, only honesty. He said he had bought her to save his life. The words lingered in the air between them, a truth finally spoken without disguise. Then his expression shifted. Not regret.
Not shame.
Understanding. And he continued. But she was the reason he finally understood how to live. The silence that followed was fragile, as if even the ruins were listening. Lyra's gaze softened. Something in her expression eased in a way Kale had never seen before. Not guarded, not distant, just present. She lifted her hand slowly and placed it against his face. The touch was gentle, not powerful, not magical, human. She spoke quietly. And for the first time, there was no mystery in her tone, only certainty. She said he was the first person who had ever looked at her and seen something beyond what had been done to her. The words hit harder than any battle Kale had ever fought, because he understood what she meant. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to feel it, enough to carry it. Kale stayed still for a moment longer. Then he asked the question that had been forming since the beginning of everything between them.
Soft.
Uncertain. He asked if she would stay. The question was not about proximity. It was about choice. About what came after survival. Lyra looked at him for a long time. The answer did not come immediately. Outside the broken throne room, the first rays of full daylight began to stretch across the burning remains of Nightfall Castle. A kingdom rebuilding itself in real time. A war fading into memory. A future still uncertain. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady.
Clear.
Uncompromising. She said she would only stay under one condition. If she stayed, it would not be as something owned. Not as a rescued slave. Not as a hidden asset. Not as a burden tied to a king's survival. She would stay only as his equal. The words settled between them like a final boundary being drawn. Kale did not hesitate. There was no calculation in his response. No hesitation of power. No instinct of control. He lowered himself slowly. Not as a ritual. Not as performance. But as surrender of rank. The Alpha King knelt in the ashes of his own throne room. Before her. And when he spoke, his voice carried no command. Only devotion shaped by understanding. He said she would stay as the queen no one would ever chain again. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Darius turned away slightly, as if witnessing something too personal to remain fully within. Lyra looked down at him. At the man who had once bought her, without knowing who she was. At the man who had unknowingly become the center of her freedom. At the man who had chosen her life over his own fear. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned forward and closed the distance between them. It was the result of everything they had survived finally becoming something neither of them could avoid any longer. Outside, the wind moved through the ruins of Nightfall Castle, carrying away smoke, carrying away ash, carrying away the last echoes of war. Inside, the Alpha King and the Lost Queen remained together in the silence after destruction. Not as ruler and captive, not as savior and burden, but as two people who had finally chosen each other in a world that had tried to define them long before they ever had the chance. Weeks passed like the turning of a wounded world learning how to breathe again. Nightfang Castle, once defined by fire and collapse, now stood half-repaired under a sky that no longer carried the weight of war. Stone was being replaced. Walls were being rebuilt. Flags that had fallen in chaos were raised again, slowly, carefully, as if even the kingdom itself was unsure it had survived what came before. And in the center of it all, change had already been decided. The council chambers were empty now. Not negotiated. Not reformed. Removed. One by one, the elders who had shaped Kale's decisions from the shadows were stripped of power. Some vanished into exile. Others were judged by their own laws. All of them erased from the structure they had quietly controlled for generations. The truth of Lyra's identity had not remained a secret. It had spread through the pack like fire through dry grass. And with it came something no one in Nightfang expected. Not rebellion. Not division. But reckoning. Because the story they had believed, that Kale had brought home a slave, had collapsed under the weight of reality. She was not property. She was not leverage. She was the last heir of the Moon Crown dynasty. And the kingdom that once viewed her as nothing was now forced to look at her as everything. Darius Vex did not stand in the center of any celebration that followed. There was no triumph for him. No return to position. No place in the new order forming around him. He stood instead at the edge of the courtyard during his exile announcement.
Still. Silent.
The same man who had once commanded armies now reduced to watching the consequences of a choice he believed had been necessary. Kale did not speak to him in anger. That absence of rage was its own kind of judgment. Darius understood that. More than punishment, it was distance. And so he accepted exile without protest. Not because he believed he was wrong, but because he finally understood what fear had cost him. As he walked away from Nightfang Castle for the last time, no one followed. No one stopped him. Only the wind moved through the rebuilt gates as if the kingdom itself was exhaling something it no longer needed to carry. Inside the castle, something different was forming. Not a return to what Nightfang had been, but something new, something untested, something no ancient record had prepared them for. And at the center of it stood Kale and Lyra. Weeks after the war, they stood before the assembled pack in the rebuilt courtyard. The stones beneath their feet were still new. The scars of battle had not fully disappeared. But the silence of that moment carried more weight than any war cry ever had. The pack watched, waiting, not for dominance, not for command,
but for identity.
Kale stepped forward first. No crown, no ceremonial armor, only presence. Lyra stood beside him, not behind, not beside as support, beside as equal. That distinction alone changed the atmosphere. The Alpha King did not introduce her as belonging to him. He did not present her as something he had brought into the pack. He acknowledged her as what she had always been, a sovereign in her own right, a truth the world had buried, and Nightfang was now forced to recognize. For a long moment, neither of them spoke beyond that acknowledgement. Because some truths do not require explanation once they are finally seen. The pack bowed, not out of submission alone, but recognition. The world had shifted, and they were witnessing the result of it. Later, when the courtyard had emptied and the kingdom resumed its slow rebuilding, Kale and Lyra stood alone on the balcony overlooking Nightfang. The wind moved through the rebuilt towers, carrying sound of life returning. Workers speaking. Children laughing faintly in distant halls. A kingdom no longer on the edge of collapse. Kale looked out over it all, and for the first time, there was no trace of the man who had been dying, only the one who remained. Lyra stood beside him in silence, not as salvation, not as mystery, but as someone who had chosen to remain. He bought her to save his life, but what began as survival did not end there. In the end, she saved far more than that. She saved his kingdom. She saved his future. And she saved the part of him that had forgotten how to live without fear. And the Alpha King who once ruled through strength and fear of death became something else entirely. A man who no longer feared living. And finally, a man worthy of love.